He was the billionaire who swore he would never love again. She was the secretary who thought her place was only behind a desk. But what happens when an elevator stalls before dawn, and fear cracks the armor of a man the world calls unshakable? What happens when the smallest act of kindness, a handwritten note that says "breathe," opens a door that neither money nor power could unlock? From Chicago's steel towers to a quiet lighthouse town on Lake Michigan, their worlds could not have been further apart. Yet step by step, gesture by gesture, they found themselves walking the same fragile path. Could a man who built an empire on control learn to trust in something as unpredictable as love? Could a woman who carried her dignity like a shield allow herself to be seen beyond the role of secretary? And when crisis strikes, when rumors, rivals, and storms rise, will they have the courage to stay? Or will the vow of never win again? Stay with us as we unfold the billionaire who swore never, until his secretary stole his heart. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the journey ahead. Before sunrise, Chicago still holds its breath. The streets of the West Loop lie under a thin crust of ice, car tires crunching faintly on the salted pavement. Inside the Whitmore Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel hum with electricity. The heating system pushes warm air through ducts that never seem to chase away the winter edge. Fluorescent lights buzz faintly in the lobby, the kind of sound most people never notice until they are left alone with it. The elevator groaned, slowed, and stopped between floors. Alexander Whitmore stood inside, one hand wrapped around the polished brass rail, the other on his wristwatch. The ticking was not loud, not really, but in the stillness it seemed amplified, a metronome against his ribs. He glanced at the face of the watch, flawless crystal, platinum casing, a gift from a board member after his last acquisition. The hand that wore it did not look flawless. Fingers curled tighter than they should, skin pale under winter light. The car did not move. Somewhere deep, the childhood fear clawed back. He had been 12 the last time he'd been trapped like this, in a stalled elevator at a county hospital while his brother lay upstairs in intensive care. That memory still carried the weight of sterile walls and the metallic sting of panic. He had built his life on control since then. He managed companies, ships, schedules, markets. Nothing slipped, yet here, between floors, nothing answered to him. Claire Bennett stood 2 steps away, steady as stone. She had been his secretary for 3 years, long enough to know the subtle flickers that most never saw. The man who had sworn publicly that he would never again be vulnerable was gripping a rail to keep his breath steady. She did not make a scene. She did not speak his name in alarm. Instead, she pressed the intercom button. Elevator stalled between 17 and 18. She reported, her voice calm. 2 passengers. Please advise. The static reply promised a reset. She turned then, not to ask if he was all right, but to offer something small. She twisted open the thermos she carried every morning, the steam of chamomile curling into the cold air. She poured a little into the lid, set it in his hand. The warmth grounded him. He noticed the faint scent floral, quiet, nothing like the antiseptic sting that had haunted his memory. She guided him without naming what she saw, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Simple words, steady rhythm. She counted quietly, each number a rung on a ladder. His chest loosened fraction by fraction. Then, almost as if she had planned it for this exact moment, she drew a scrap of paper from her pocket. The letters were blocky, written in dark pen, "Breathe." She set it near the panel. The command was almost childlike, stripped of elegance, but it worked. His gaze fixed on it, not on the frozen floor indicator. The elevator shuddered once, a low whir. Then motion returned, slow at first, then steady. The car opened onto the lobby. Salt clung to the floor mats where early crews had tracked in winter slush. The smell of sanitizer hung in the air, sharp and cold. Outside, a gust of wind bent east, rattling against the glass doors. He stepped out, coat collar pulled high. She walked beside him, heels making muted taps on the polished stone. For Claire, the incident was filed with other routine inconveniences: a copier jam, a flight delayed, a printer that refused to connect. She would archive it in her mind and move on to the day's tasks. There were contracts waiting upstairs, schedules, board minutes to draft. For Alex, something felt left behind in that steel box. A layer of armor, maybe. The myth of being unshakable had tilted. He reached into his pocket and slipped the paper note inside, folding it as carefully as one might fold a key. The two of them parted in the lobby, he to the stairwell that led up toward offices, she to the security desk to confirm their arrival. No words were exchanged about what had passed. The world outside did not need to know. Yet the silence between them was not empty. It carried the weight of air going in and out, of a small kindness under fluorescent light. Upstairs, calendars and contracts waited, orderly as ever. Deadlines did not care about moments of breath. Downstairs, the lake wind pressed harder against the east-facing glass. Two worlds were about to be drawn more cleanly, his world of steel and control, hers of steady routine and quiet resilience. They had crossed once inside an elevator before sunrise. They would cross again. Morning broke in two places at once. In Chicago, the steel ribs of skyscrapers glowed faintly blue under a slate-gray sky. Frost clung to the bridges that stitched the river. The city moved early, trucks rattling past warehouses, steam rising from grates like restless sighs. 2 states north, in Harbor Point, Michigan. A lighthouse blinked its slow rhythm across a quiet harbor, ice crusted along the pier, gulls shifting restlessly on the wind. In a modest kitchen that smelled of toast and liniment, a daughter watched her mother stretch stiff hands before rising from her chair. The pace there was slower, but no less exacting. Alexander Whitmore's day unfolded in minutes and miles. His assistant had lined up security briefings, port updates, and a call with Washington about infrastructure funding. His calendar stacked blocks of time like containers on a ship, color-coded and rigid. A newspaper headline praised his company's philanthropy, a 7-figure donation toward renewable fuels. The words read clean, like polished glass. He closed the page without finishing. The impact felt distant, almost sterile. Nothing like the elevator moment before sunrise when one scrap of paper had mattered more than all the commas in a press release. Claire Bennett's world held Harbor Point. She spent Sundays driving out to check on her mother, Ellen. Arthritis made mornings slow, each movement deliberate. Ellen hid pain behind gentle humor, but Claire still noticed when she gripped the counter too long or rubbed her knuckles when she thought no one was watching. The town library, once bright, now bore a leaking roof patched with tarps. Flyers for the fundraiser hung on folding tables in the church basement, corners curling from damp air. A bake sale would keep the lights on for another month. Casseroles circulated through the neighborhood, lids marked in black marker with names Mac and Cheese, Johnson Family, Beef Stew, Martha. This was generosity, too. Though no cameras came to record it, Claire carried those lists with as much care as she carried board packets for Chicago meetings. She knew which neighbor needed a ride to dialysis, which student at the local high school had a coat too thin for February. Nathan Hale, chief financial officer and Alex's longest friend, kept his watchful eye on both man and company. He noticed things others ignored. Alex's edges softened whenever Claire's name surfaced. A question about her travel arrangements, or the way her notes anticipated a decision before he voiced it. Nathan did not mock. He simply marked the risk, as he always did, balancing columns in his mind. Policy said one thing, humanity sometimes said another. Symbols threaded through quietly. On Claire's refrigerator, a postcard showed the Harbor Point lighthouse, its paint peeling on the edges. The card had been sent years ago, before her father left. Yet she kept it pinned by a magnet shaped like a tomato. One corner had curled from steam rising off countless dinners. In Alex's pocket ticked the antique wristwatch, once his father's. It had survived mergers, flights, storms on the Great Lakes. Its crystal never cracked, but its meaning shifted. He still checked it compulsively, though more to measure control than to mark hours. The contrast between their worlds was honest, not cruel, lake patience against city velocity. In Chicago, catered trays arrived with garnish no one touched. In Harbor Point, neighbors lined up with foil-covered pans, humble and heavy. Alex's office smelled faintly of leather and ink. Claire's childhood home smelled of lemon polish and the faint must of old hymnals. He carried the weight of thousands of jobs balanced on market shifts. She carried the weight of one mother's pain and a library roof sagging in winter. Public generosity lived in press releases. Alex knew the cadence well: corporate responsibility, strategic giving, language scrubbed until it gleamed. But private generosity lived in grocery lists, in casserole dishes, in the quiet duty of driving someone to an appointment across icy roads. The second kind carried more weight. Claire's life was built on it, not for headlines, but because someone had to keep the light steady when storms pressed against the shoreline. By evening, their clocks still ticked in different keys. Alex closed another briefing, numbers scrolling across his screen like tides he could never quite command. Claire folded another flyer, her fingers sore from the cold. Both lives continued, separate, yet something in the rhythm of that stalled elevator lingered. He had pocketed her note. She had moved on, but neither had entirely forgotten. Weather radar painted the Great Lakes in winter color, swaths of blue and green curling across the screen. Storm warnings gathered, and with them came the pull of docks demanding inspection. Freight never slept, not in February, not when profit depended on shipments arriving through ice and wind. Schedules would send Alex toward the lakeshore. Claire's path, after hours, would carry her through Union Station on her way home. Two separate lives, timed by different clocks, were drifting toward another crossing. Union Station breathed out warmth into a cold Chicago night. Doors swung open as waves of commuters hurried through, boots scraping on wet tile, the smell of pretzels and coffee mixed with damp wool coats. Announcements echoed against the high ceilings, metallic and flat. Claire Bennett moved carefully through the crowd, balancing a twine-tied bakery box against her duffel bag. Lemon bars wrapped in wax paper bumped against her hip. They were bound for a fundraiser in Harbor Point, where church tables would sag under homemade goods. Her hair clung slightly with the damp air, her breath visible as she stepped toward the platform. Her mind ticked with schedule's departure time, transfer, arrival before dawn. She had mapped it already, as she did with most things. Yet the station still pressed heavy on her shoulders, a swirl of noise and strangers. At the curb outside, Alexander Whitmore stood waiting. He rarely waited for anything. His time was mapped to the minute. Every mile counted. Yet tonight he stood with hands in his pockets, collar raised against the bite of wind, eyes scanning the entrance. A man who commanded fleets seemed, for a moment, simply present. When he caught sight of her, a small shift passed across his face. Not surprise, not obligation, something quieter. He offered a ride. His words were framed as courtesy. Her duffel looked heavy. The train ride long, but the choice sat differently. It was not company policy. It was not efficiency. It was a man deciding to walk beside her path. Even briefly. She hesitated. Harbor Point was 3 hours north. She was used to trains, to sitting pressed between strangers, to balancing a bakery box on her lap. But the offer carried no pressure. Just a door opened. She stepped through. The car eased into traffic. Streetlights glinted off salted pavement, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Claire sat with the box on her lap, fingers curled into the twine. Alex kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loose. Silence filled the first miles, not awkward, but unpracticed. Halfway up the corridor, hunger announced itself in her stomach. He noticed before she spoke, a green neon sign flickered along the road, a 24-hour diner. He turned in without asking, parking beneath a buzzing lamp. Inside, heat hit like a wave. The air smelled of frying onions and coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. Truckers filled booths, shoulders hunched, voices low and steady. Plates clinked. A waitress moved like she knew every face. They slid into a corner booth. She ordered coffee and pie. He matched her order, though he usually skipped dessert. The neon clock above the counter hummed faintly, its hands crawling past 10. She noticed how he faced the door, eyes tracing exits, shoulders angled for view. It was not paranoia, but habit. He studied every environment, always calculating. She wondered how heavy it was to live that way, never fully at ease. He noticed how she made space. She shifted her chair when the waitress passed, moved her plate so the busboy could set down water glasses without reaching too far. She created air for others without thinking. He found it striking, this instinctive kindness woven into small actions. They talked little, and what they said stayed simple. Weather, the salt shortage that worried towns along the lake, the long haul of freight trains moving through the night. Yet each sentence carried weight. She listened with her full face turned toward him, eyes steady. He realized he had spoken more openly about dock delays than he had in 10 investor calls. Coffee warmed their hands. The pie was sweet and ordinary, lemon against flaky crust, the kind of food that did not need garnish to matter. When they left, the wind bit harder, the lot glazed with thin ice. He walked her to the passenger side, waited until she was settled. Salt crunched beneath his shoes. For once, he did not think about schedules. They drove the next stretch with fewer words, the road humming under tires, the horizon lined with dark trees. The duffel shifted slightly with each curve, the bakery box steady in her lap. Impact hid in the small scene. A counter, 2 plates, and a man learning more about the woman beside him than he had from weeks of boardroom speeches. No declarations, no vows, just clean attention under a neon clock and coffee poured into heavy mugs. When they reached her transfer stop, she stepped out into the cold with the duffel on her shoulder and the box still safe in her arms. He watched her walk toward the platform, boots firm on salted ground. No promises were spoken. Yet something lingered. A sense of a door opened without a creak. Both phones buzzed at once with a winter alert. Storm bands stretched across the Great Lakes. Docks would demand inspection before dawn. The road north promised wind and noise. The night was not done drawing them toward the same horizon. Wind clawed across the lakeside lot in Milwaukee, lifting grit into the air and pressing against parked cars. The temperature sat at 28 degrees, the kind that made every breath sting and every sound sharper. A heater groaned inside the sedan, where Alex Whitmore and Claire Bennett sat for a brief pause before the next inspection. Cranes loomed over the dock, their arms reached like frozen skeletons against a steel-gray sky. Gulls tilted and dove, their cries cutting through the clink of chains that carried across water. Barges edged through ice floes with groans deep enough to feel in the chest. The work never paused, not for weather, not for exhaustion. Freight had to move, or the whole line staggered. Claire scanned the itinerary, marking what could wait and what could not. She had made one adjustment already. Instead of a small sedan from the motor pool, she requested a larger SUV, wide seats, steady suspension, no cramped corners. Alex had said nothing, but she saw his shoulders ease when he climbed in. She routed their path away from a tunnel that pinched too tight and asked the escort to cut sirens, using plain lights instead. Her care lived in details no one else noticed. Now, in the half hour between sights, she pulled out a small jar from her bag. Balm for her cracked hands. Winter air and endless paper handling had left skin raw, cut at the edges. She smoothed it over her knuckles, wincing at the sting. He noticed. Alex's gaze lingered for a moment longer than casual. He did not comment then. The heater clicked on again, filling silence with mechanical hum. She capped the jar and slipped it back into her bag. The day stretched long. They walked the length of the docks, voices raised to be heard over machinery. Workers in heavy coats called greetings, their faces lined from cold wind and long hours. Claire kept pace, clipboard steady, hair pulled tight against gusts. Alex spoke with foreman, eyes narrowing at rust where it shouldn't be. at ropes pulled too thin. She caught the quick flinch whenever a siren wailed from a distant road. She stepped in, redirecting attention, pulling him back to concrete details. It worked. The day held. Later, when they returned to the Chicago office, her desk looked ordinary, papers stacked, calendar set, phone blinking with reminders. Yet among the files lay something new, a tube of hand cream, plain but well chosen. Beside it, a note in clean, deliberate writing. For the person who keeps my days from freezing. She stood still, reading the sentence twice. Not flowers, not tickets, nothing grand, just balm, and words that meant he had seen. He had noticed the ache she carried without asking for it to be acknowledged. Heat spread through her chest like a fire catching after long cold. He did not mention the gift. He passed her desk with the same steady stride as always, tie straight, coat draped over his arm. But the corner of his mouth softened when their eyes met. That softness lingered in her thoughts long after. Trust widened that day. Though neither named it, it grew in the space between small actions, gestures exchanged without weight of expectation, backstories pressed at the edges, carried quietly like stones in pockets. For him, a brother lost in a lake accident when they were young. Water that had swallowed more than one life still haunted his nights. For her, a father who had walked away when money ran thin, leaving Ellen to patch together dignity from scraps. Both carried absences they rarely spoke of. Both knew silence could be heavier than words. She placed the hand cream into her bag, not for display, but for use. He kept working through contracts, yet checked the time more often than before, as if each tick of the inherited watch marked more than schedules. The rhythm of their days shifted by inches. The cold outside stayed brutal, but warmth passed between them in ways no one else noticed. A jar of balm. A sentence written without flourish. A recognition that meant more than grand gestures ever could. Toward the end of that week, a new envelope arrived, heavy cardstock, embossed with gold. An invitation to the Art Institute gala, chandeliers and cameras guaranteed. Claire turned it in her hands, unsure. Rooms like that belonged to people who wore gowns without worry, people who never brought bake sale flyers in their bags. She imagined marble floors echoing with heels sharper than hers, voices polished by years of expectation. She hesitated, thumb pressed against the sealed flap. Yet the look in Alex's eyes when he mentioned it was not command. It was belief. Belief that she could stand in those rooms, that there was space for her light beside chandeliers. The wind outside howled against glass. Inside, something steadier began to form. Marble floors gleamed under chandelier light, polished so bright they could have been ice. Strings played softly from a corner, the notes competing with the murmur of voices rising and falling like tides. Cameras flashed in patient intervals, catching gowns that swept the floor and tuxedos cut sharp enough to slice through the air. Claire Bennett paused just inside the entrance of the Art Institute. Her dress was thrifted, navy satin altered by a neighbor with clever hands. It fit her well enough, though the hem wavered slightly where the thread pulled. She wore earrings from her mother's box, small silver lighthouses that swung gently when she moved. They felt like an anchor, though she doubted anyone here noticed. Her posture was straight, her chin level, but inside, doubt traced the corners. She kept checking the distance to the door, rehearsing escape routes she would never take. Alexander Whitmore stood beside her, his presence steady, his watch gleaming under the lights. To the world, he looked unshakable, the same billionaire who once declared to a magazine that love was a distraction he would never again entertain. Tonight, the same watch that ticked in every photo caught the flash of another headline waiting to be written. Nathan Hale moved like a shadow, speaking with donors, redirecting questions when gossip drifted too close. He knew the weight of HR policy. He knew what it meant for his friend to be seen here with Claire. He balanced facts with discretion, keeping conversations neutral, polite, unmemorable. Then Olivia Carlyle entered. She carried Polish the way some carried perfume layered, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Her gown shimmered like oil under light. Her smile was smooth. her words timed with precision. She was a storm without thunder, the kind that bent trees by steady pressure instead of force. She drifted toward Alex with ease, speaking the language of polished rooms where image always outran truth. Claire watched from a half step away. She had no illusions about competing with that kind of presence. Olivia belonged here, born into circles where chandeliers hung like old friends and velvet ropes opened with the tilt of a chin. Claire's earrings felt suddenly fragile, more suited for bake sales than marble halls. The photographers noticed the pairing quickly. Their lenses caught Alex's wristwatch, Claire's profile, the lighthouse earrings swinging under gold light. Headlines would resurrect his old vow and pair it with her face. They would label what had begun with a scrap of paper in an elevator, reducing it to spectacle. Compliments floated by, wrapped around judgments. "How refreshing," someone said, tone bending towards surprise. "She looks so approachable." The word felt like a needle. Another voice whispered, "He'll return to form soon. They always do." Claire kept her eyes steady, her smile measured, but inside she felt each word sink deep. It was not Olivia's presence that stung the most. It was the room itself, the assumption that a woman like Claire could only ever be a phase, a novelty, a softer season before he returned to the sharp world he knew best. The narrative stripped away the humanity of what had started in silence, under fluorescent light, with nothing but a note telling him to breathe. Alex leaned closer once, his hand steady at her back, his voice low enough only she could hear. "You belong here." The words helped, but only partly. Belonging was not about one man's assurance. It was about the room itself, the eyes, the whispers, the headlines already being drafted. Nathan caught her glance once, the brief flicker of unease she could not hide. His look back was gentle, the same as if he had been watching his own sister enter cold water. He gave a slight nod, as though reminding her she was not invisible. Still, the marble pressed heavy underfoot, and the chandeliers burned with a kind of heat that made her long for air. The evening stretched with speeches and handshakes. Alex played his part smoothly, his charm polished but not false. Claire followed, listening, offering quiet words when needed, her presence more than ornamental, though few realized it. All the while, the echo of judgments ran beneath the music. By the end, when cameras flashed one last time, Claire felt the weight of an old vow pressing sharp against her ribs. The vow had been his, spoken years ago, but tonight it was hers to bear. The room had decided she was a temporary footnote in a longer story. She wondered how long before he, too, believed it. When they finally slipped out, marble gave way to cold night air. Their driver pulled up, but Alex paused, meeting her eyes. "There's somewhere quieter," he said. He didn't wait for her answer, only opened the door. 10 minutes later, they ducked into a hidden jazz bar near Union Station. The ceilings were low, the light dim, the music alive in ways chandeliers could never manage. The air loosened, conversation softened. Music held space for something almost said, almost confessed. A trumpet bent into a blue note that lingered just above the crowd before it fell into rhythm again. The hidden bar near Union Station was dim, wrapped in brass and wood, with coats draped over chairs and glasses fogged from the heat of the room. For the first time that week, Alex and Claire sat without files or calendars, just two people in the dark, their knees covered by folded coats. The music carried what words could not. Each chord seemed to loosen something that had been knotted too tight. Claire felt her shoulders drop against the back of her chair, her breath slow with the beat. Alex leaned forward, elbows on the small table, watching the stage with a concentration that was less about business and more about listening. The trumpet player slid into a softer line, and conversation dipped around them. Claire thought about speaking, about saying something that would mark the moment for what it was. Instead, she let silence stretch. Words hovered close, but did not break the surface. Alex's eyes found hers once. There was weight there, a question not yet asked, the kind that might have opened a door if given time. His hand shifted on the table, fingers brushing near hers but not touching. Then the sound fractured. A phone lit up against the dark, vibrating with urgency. One alert, then another. The brass kept playing, but the spell had already cracked like glass. Alex glanced at the screen, his face tightened, eyes narrowing. A barge collision on the Great Lakes, a flare from the Union. Supply chains bleeding, not in numbers, but in families that depended on steady wages. The music kept moving, but his chair scraped back. He rose with no complaint, no hesitation, only duty. Claire saw it all without him saying a word. She read the meaning in his expression, in the way he rolled his shoulders back into armor. This was not neglect, not avoidance. This was who he was, someone called to stand when the cost was highest. She could have asked him to stay, just for one more song. She could have asked for words he was not ready to give. Instead, she chose steadiness. She folded her coat over her arm, lifted her bag, and met him at the door. Outside, the night had teeth. The air bit hard against skin, and the city lights cast long reflections on the slick pavement. For a moment, neither spoke. Their breath rose in pale clouds. Alex turned slightly, as though to explain, but she shook her head before he could. "Go," she said quietly, not as dismissal, but as permission. He nodded once, then stepped into the waiting car. The door shut with a muffled sound, and the taillights bled red across wet asphalt. Claire stood on the curb, the trumpet still echoing faintly behind her, the night pressing close. There was no argument, no goodbye, only the lesson that real life rarely paused for tender beginnings. She walked toward the train, her steps steady though her chest felt heavy. Inside, she replayed the almost confession that had lived between them, unfinished, hanging like a cord that never resolved. The warmth of the bar had been real, but so was the cold that followed. Both were true, both would matter. The train carried her north. She leaned her head against the glass, watching the city recede. She thought about how quickly joy could fracture, how silence could grow sharp edges when left too long. Still, she did not regret staying, not even for half a song. Alex's night stretched long in another way. By the time he reached the office, the collision was already front-page news. Screens filled with maps, figures, warnings. His team was waiting. Nathan briefed him with clipped sentences, outlining damage, possible strikes, the risk of cascading delays. Alex listened, eyes hard but tired, his hand brushing once against the antique watch at his wrist as though to ground himself. He did not think about the bar, not in that moment. He thought about cargo, families, the balance that could tip entire towns into hardship if not handled with precision. Duty consumed every corner. Yet, later, when the office fell into a brief lull, when the coffee cooled and reports blurred into numbers, he thought of her, sitting in low light, her coat across her knees, her hands folded still. He thought of the almost question in her eyes. He let himself remember before burying it again under the weight of work. Claire reached Harbor Point near dawn. The lighthouse blinked faintly across water, steady, patient. She stepped into her mother's kitchen, where the smell of brewed coffee and folded laundry grounded her. Ellen looked up, reading her daughter's face without asking. Claire smiled, small but sufficient. They spoke of simple things, groceries, a library fundraiser, the leaky roof that needed fixing before spring rains. Yet, in the quiet between sentences, Claire waited for a message, for a call, for anything that said the night had not simply broken in two. Nothing came. Silence grew teeth. 3 dawns came and went without pause. The Chicago skyline shifted from dark to gray to light and back again. But inside the boardrooms where Alex Whitmore lived those 72 hours, time had no seasons. The air was stale with coffee, anxiety, and the constant churn of voices debating what could not be undone. A barge collision, union strikes, supply lines split open like wounds that would not clot. Every hour demanded triage. Every call from the coast bled into legal strategy. Every meeting stacked on another until minutes blurred into exhaustion. Alex's thermos cooled in the corner of his desk, untouched, forgotten. He rubbed the bridge of his nose until skin reddened, then straightened his shoulders for the next round. The Great Lakes did not bend for grief or romance. They swallowed men whole in winter storms, and now they swallowed weeks without mercy. Alex told himself he was steady, unbroken, focused. But when silence filled the spaces between calls, the image of Claire's face under dim jazz bar light broke through. He forced it away. There was no room for it now. Hostile leaks worsened everything. Papers ran old quotes, resurrecting the vow he had once made never to let his private life distract from his empire. The irony cut deep. Investors demanded explanations that left him raw, as though his humanity was the greatest liability of all. He gave them numbers, projections, promises. Inside, his pulse thudded against ribs like a prisoner's fist on stone. Claire shielded his schedule until there was nothing left to shield. She took calls meant for him, softened edges with polite tones, rearranged meetings when fatigue lined his face. She caught whispers in the hall that spread like cold drafts. HR policy hummed underneath, louder each day. The story had shifted from admiration to speculation, and speculation turned quickly into rumor. She could bear long hours. She could bear waiting. What she could not bear was being reduced to gossip, her name traded like currency at corners of polished tables. Her dignity was her own. She would not let it be bargained away. On the third evening, she sat at her small apartment desk. The resignation letter had been drafted, erased, drafted again. This time, her handwriting was steady. Each curve of the pen marked a decision she did not want but could not avoid. Her phone lay face down. She no longer checked it. The doorbell startled her. Nathan stood in the hall, coat still dusted with lake snow. His face carried something his role did not allow regret. He did not step inside far, only far enough to speak low. "He's fighting fires you can't see," Nathan said. "He isn't choosing silence. Silence is just the battle itself." Claire's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze level. "It still feels like neglect." Nathan's eyes softened. He could not deny it. He trusted her integrity, but could not promise more. Some lines his position forbade him to cross. He left with a nod that was both apology and respect. She returned to the letter, folded it once, twice, tucked it into an envelope. She set her pen aside and let her hand rest on the paper. Her chest hurt, as if she had run too far in cold air. She whispered nothing aloud, but inside, she said goodbye. The act of signing was small. The weight of it was not. She paused, breath held, then released it slowly. A pause that marked the end of something not yet allowed to bloom. The next morning, she carried the letter to HR. The walk down the corridor felt longer than the miles between Harbor Point and Chicago. Her shoes clicked against marble in even rhythm. Each step said, "I choose myself." She handed the envelope over, her hands calm, her smile polite. The director nodded, eyes skimming briefly with something like sympathy, though policy erased personal response. Paper was filed, position erased. Claire walked out lighter, though the lightness was the kind that follows amputation. She told herself it was survival. She told herself it was grace. Both were true. That afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling beside her. Outside, snowflakes drifted in slow spirals past the window. She pulled a bus ticket across the wood surface. The ink was fresh. Harbor Point waited with its taped flyers and leaky roofs. She would return to her mother, to the lighthouse blinking at 10-second intervals across the harbor, steady as a metronome. She packed her bag with careful order, sweaters folded, a thermos wrapped in a scarf, her mother's earrings placed inside a small box. She tucked the resignation copy on top, proof she had chosen dignity over rumor, proof she had signed her name without trembling. Night fell early. The city glowed cold outside her window. She closed her eyes, let her head rest against her hands, and breathed. She told herself she had not been foolish to hope. Hope was never foolish. It was simply costly. Somewhere across the city, Alex was still in a room that smelled of stale coffee and frayed nerves. speaking numbers into air that devoured him. He had no idea that on another desk, his secretary had folded a letter that left his world a little more empty. The town library roof had been leaking since Christmas. A blue tarp sagged under pooled rainwater, its edges held down by bricks and the faith of volunteers. Flyers taped to the entrance curled at the corners, the ink fading where damp air had touched it. The bake sale announcement listed pies, cookies, and a raffle for a quilt stitched decades ago. Home was not perfect, but it was honest. A woman could stand here and be whole without permission. Claire Bennett stepped out of the cold into that space again. Harbor Point smelled the same as when she left salt in the wind, dust in the stacks of donated books, coffee from the diner drifting across Main Street. Her mother sat in the kitchen, warming her joints before standing, hands folded loosely around a mug. Ellen Bennett smiled when Claire walked in, relief evident in the small lift of her shoulders. Neighbors brought pies wrapped in foil, bread sealed in plastic bags with Sharpie labels. They did not ask questions. They handed food over with nods, glad to have another pair of hands back in town. Conversation stayed simple, the fishing season, the school needing new lockers, the library roof waiting for warmer weather. No cameras, no velvet ropes, no chandeliers, only the rhythm of lives lived in plain sight. Claire filed her resignation with finality. Copies mailed and confirmed. The paper was light in her hand, but heavy in consequence. She set the Chicago chapter aside with the care one gives to breakable glass. She kept moving toward what needed her, now the fundraiser. Lists grew under her handwriting. Tape held signs against folding tables. She checked off items: coffee urn, raffle tickets, paper napkins stacked in neat piles. She arranged bake sale goods with the precision of someone who understood presentation mattered even in small places. Each pie was more than dessert. Each purchase helped patch the roof that kept books safe for children who had few other places to sit and dream. At night, she lay in her childhood room. On the nightstand, she kept one item from Chicago, the tiny note that told her to breathe, block letters on paper no larger than her palm. It belonged to her story, not just his. She touched it with her fingertips, not with longing, but with recognition. The note reminded her she had steadied someone once, and that mattered even if the world called it a phase. She reminded herself daily that returning was not retreat. It was a reset, a strong one, built from the inside out. She folded laundry, drove her mother to appointments, carried boxes to the church basement, and signed up for shifts at the library. Every act was small, but together they rebuilt the ground under her feet. Coffee at the diner tasted simple and right. The mug was heavy, chipped at the rim, the kind of imperfection that kept things real. She listened to old men argue about fishing regulations. She listened to young mothers trade babysitting schedules. No one treated her as an oddity. She was just Claire again, not a headline, not a whisper in marble halls. The lake blinked its rhythm each night from the lighthouse. 10-second intervals, a metronome for courage. She watched from her window sometimes, steady in the knowledge that light was more than a signal. It was persistence. In quiet moments, she allowed herself to miss him. She remembered the heater groaning in a Milwaukee lot, the balm set on her desk, the jazz note that had carried almost long enough, but she refused to rewrite it as weakness. She had chosen self-respect over spectacle, community over optics. That choice would hold even when memory pressed close. The fundraiser date arrived. Clouds gathered heavy over Lake Michigan. Thunder grumbled low across the water, rolling toward town. Flyers flapped against poles, straining against wind. Volunteers tied down tents, checked that tables were weighted with stacks of canned goods and taped boxes. Inside the library, Claire set pies in order, each labeled with names of those who had baked them. The room smelled of cinnamon, sugar, and wet wool from coats hung on hooks. The floor creaked under footsteps as neighbors filed in, coins rattling in jars, tickets traded for slices of bread and laughter. Outside, wind pushed at 50 miles per hour, bending the flag on the pole almost horizontal. Rain lashed sideways. The storm pressed hard against the small town, but inside, the fundraiser carried on. People leaned closer, speaking louder over the sound of rattling windows. Claire checked the raffle box, adjusted the tape on a sign that kept peeling away. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her hands were cold, but her eyes were steady. She belonged here. She knew it in her bones. Then the door opened. Wind swept in, sharp with rain. A figure stood in the frame, soaked through, carrying books under a coat. For a moment, the room fell quiet, as though the storm had entered with him. Claire's breath caught. She had not expected this door, this night, this return. Thunder pressed low against Harbor Point. Windows rattled in their frames. Umbrellas shook water onto the linoleum floor of the library, dripping beside coats hung on hooks. The bake sale table sagged slightly under the weight of pies, each labeled in black marker. Lemon bars disappeared quickly, plates scraped clean by children who licked sugar from their fingers. The door burst open again. Rain followed a man inside, soaking the threshold. His coat was heavy, collar pulled high, books pressed beneath the fabric like contraband hope. His hands were marked by burns, red along the skin where dock lines had caught and seared during long nights. He moved without ceremony, setting the stack of books on a table, sliding a folded check beside a plate of lemon bars. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a laborer who had worked past his strength. Claire froze. She had not imagined this return. Alexander Whitmore stood only a few feet away, soaked through, eyes dark from days with little sleep. He had come not to a gala, not to a boardroom, but here where she had asked her town to show up. Murmurs moved through the room. Volunteers shifted, whispering at the stranger who bought pies without asking for change, who carried boxes instead of speeches. Claire's throat tightened. She could not look away. When they finally faced each other, his words came steady, not polished. He explained the crisis in plain terms. The accident had been no accident alone. Sabotage had been uncovered, traced back to partners who had cut corners too often. He had chosen compromise that preserved jobs even while costing him power. "We severed ties," he said simply. It hurt. But families keep their wages. That matters more. The explanation was not performance. It was clarity. He owed it to her. He did not stop there. He brought structure instead of promises. From his coat pocket, he pulled a folded document, not grand but deliberate. A role at the Whitmore Foundation, based in Harbor Point, focused on Great Lakes literacy and job training. "You'd never report to me," he said, his voice careful. "It's yours to shape. I wanted to build something that lives here, not in glass towers." Claire's breath caught. He was not pulling her back into his world. He was meeting her in hers. Then he opened his palm. A small brass key rested against his skin. Its edges were worn smooth, its weight plain. "A cabin," he said, "lakeside. My family held it through grief. I haven't used it in years. I'd rather it be opened again." He let the key sit there, waiting, not pressing. From his other pocket came tissue folded around a small shape. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a pendant no larger than a dime. A lighthouse, etched in simple lines, threaded on a chain of modest silver. He set it on the table between them, not as a jewel, but as symbol. "This belongs where light holds against storms." The town watched, curious but quiet. To them, he was a soaked stranger who moved chairs, stacked boxes, and left the place better than he found it. To Claire, he was a man asking, not claiming. Her fingers brushed the pendant. Warmth spread through her chest, not from the metal, but from what it represented. Presence, not performance. Choice, not demand. For a moment, silence held them, only the sound of rain against windows, thunder rumbling beyond. She searched his face for arrogance, for the man who once said never. Instead, she found weariness, humility, and something steadier than either. The fundraiser carried on around them. Tickets changed hands. Children balanced cookies on napkins. Life went forward as it always did. Yet here, in this corner of the library, something shifted. Claire lifted her gaze. "Why here?" she whispered. Alex's answer was simple. "Because this is where you are." The words landed heavier than any vow. She let the key rest on the table. She let the pendant lie between them. She did not decide yet. She only let the moment breathe. Redemption had arrived not as apology, not as spectacle, but as presence. When the rain lessened, they stepped together toward the book stacks. Paper smelled faintly of damp, of ink, of time. Stormlight filtered through narrow windows, painting the aisles in shifting gray. They stood among shelves that had seen generations pass. Words waited, steady, unhurried, and for the first time in many weeks, so did they. The library grew quiet once the last volunteers slipped home through the rain. Only the tick of water against old windows marked the storm outside. Among the stacks, paper smelled of dust and damp air. Light pooled soft and gray where ceiling fixtures hummed faintly. Claire stood between shelves of children's books, the lighthouse pendant resting against her skin. Alex joined her there, still damp from the storm, his coat folded over his arm. For a moment, they said nothing. Silence had weight, but not the crushing kind. It felt more like space opening. He broke it first. His voice was low, stripped of polish. That vow I made years ago never to let anyone close. People said it was pride. The truth is, it was fear. He let the words sit, not rushing. Armor I wore because losing once nearly broke me. Easier to call it principle than admit it was defense. Claire listened, her hand brushing the spine of a book. She let him finish before answering. I understand armor. I wore my own. Dignity is mine to keep. If we try this, it has to hold. No shadows, no whispered rumors deciding for us. Her voice steadied as she spoke. Clear lines at work, clear lines at home, or it won't stand. He nodded, not in agreement alone, but in recognition. Then we build it that way. They set it down plain, each boundary on its own breath. She would lead the Harbor point-based foundation program. He would commute, carving out Fridays like a promise. No meetings, no excuses. Transparency with Nathan and with HR would be absolute. No secrets to corrode what they meant to protect. It was not romance alone. It was structure, drawn with care so tenderness had room to grow. Alex reached into his pocket. The brass key lay in his palm again, warm from his skin. He held it out, not as possession, but as invitation. This is yours if you want it. A cabin that kept my family when we had little else. I'd like you to use it, not for escape, for refuge. Claire took it slowly. The weight surprised her, heavier than its size suggested. She closed her hand around it, feeling the metal press into her palm. The act was quiet, but decisive. The lighthouse pendant at her throat warmed with her body's heat. Neither item was about wealth. Both were about welcome, symbols of doors opened, of light kept steady against storms. She exhaled, long and steady. Then we begin here. The words did not float as wish. They settled as plan. Alex's eyes softened. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, he let himself stand without armor. I don't want you to be an exception to my vow. I want the vow gone. Claire reached for his hand, not with urgency but with calm certainty. Then let it go. They stood like that among shelves, the storm easing outside. What they kept were not just tokens but choices her dignity, his honesty, their shared lines of care. Love stepped out of wish and into plan. The clock on the wall ticked steady. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, waves still hit stone. But the worst of the storm had already passed. When they stepped out into the night, the air carried the smell of rain-washed pavement. The town slept. The library lights dimmed behind them. Morning was a few hours off. The rest of their life would not begin with spectacle, but with ordinary tasks. And that was enough. A paper calendar hung in the kitchen, the kind with squares too small for all that life carried. Yet in the corner of each Friday, a small heart was drawn in blue ink, a simple mark, steady as a lighthouse beam. Dinner at 6 became more than a habit. It was a line of defense. Phones were put away. sometimes reluctantly, but the rule held. A meal eaten with attention had more power than any boardroom table. The library roof no longer leaked. Rain fell against shingles that held firm. Inside, children sprawled on beanbags, books open across their knees. The sound of pages turning was a kind of hymn. Weeks settled into rhythm, Monday through Thursday. Alex lived the city's tempo. Chicago claimed him with its schedules, its glass towers, its unrelenting pace. But every Friday evening, his path bent north. The road stretched long along the lake, headlights cutting through dark fields. By midnight, the Harbor Point exit sign rose like a welcome. Claire's world was steady, but never still. She led the Great Lakes program with a hand both firm and kind. Apprentices found placements at local docks. GED certificates arrived in the mail, celebrated with sheet cakes in church basements. Paychecks came regular enough to mend more than bank accounts, they mended dignity. At staff meetings, she pinned notes of thanks to a bulletin board, scribbled letters from parents, folded cards from trainees, photographs of children holding up their first library cards. The wall became a gallery of proof that quiet work mattered. Alex carried those images with him back into skyscraper offices. He spoke of roofs repaired and futures rebuilt. Nathan noticed the difference. Reports grew more grounded, less abstract. HR, once watchful, quietly closed the file that had whispered of risk. Olivia's orbit spun elsewhere, her storms aimed at other rooms. Small rituals rooted the heart. Chamomile tea at 9:30 p.m., steam rising in familiar cups. Alex's antique wristwatch set gently on the nightstand, the leather band worn smooth by years. Morning walks along the pier, even when light snow dusted the planks, became a rhythm of breath and step. These rituals stitched two lives into one fabric without tearing at either seam. For Claire, the balance felt like exhaling after holding breath too long. She did not vanish into his world, nor did he diminish in hers. Each sphere stood, and yet they overlapped in ways that gave strength instead of taking it. One evening, as they walked along the pier, Alex spoke what had been quietly forming. It doesn't have to be either or. His eyes traced the horizon where water met sky. We don't have to choose city over shore, or empire over community. We can hold both. Claire smiled, the lighthouse pendant catching faint light. Both and, she answered, two words that felt like an anchor. The climax was not in grand gestures, but in this integration. Neither life swallowed the other. Chicago boardrooms did not erase Harbor Point casseroles. The lake's patience steadied the city's velocity. Together, they formed a rhythm sustainable enough to endure. Seasons shifted. Snow thawed into the wet green of spring. The program's first class of trainees graduated, their families filling folding chairs in a gymnasium that smelled of varnished wood. Alex clapped the loudest, his voice hoarse from pride. Claire watched him from the stage, the brass key resting in her purse, and felt the truth settle deeper. This was not a phase. This was life, built with care. Their Fridays became holy in their own way. Sometimes simple meals, sometimes shared silence, sometimes laughter that spilled past midnight. Always presence, always both. The magazine request came in a neat envelope with a glossy masthead. They wanted a profile not of wealth, not of deals, but of the man who had restructured his empire around human hours and community roots. Alex hesitated. For once, it did not feel like an opportunity to seize, but a story to choose carefully. He set the letter aside on the kitchen table. Dawn light streamed through lace curtains, pale gold against wood. "If I answer," he said softly, "I want to do it here, at the cabin, by the lake, where it began to change." Claire nodded. That feels right. The storm had passed. The rhythm was steady. What lay ahead was not less demanding, but it was shared, both and. Two mugs rested on the porch rail, steam rising into the morning air. The lake stretched wide and calm, holding the pale gold of late summer light. A gull skimmed low, its wings catching a ripple of sun before disappearing toward the horizon. By the door, A small brass key hung on a hook. Ordinary now. No ceremony, no weight. Just part of a home. Some stories did not end with headlines. They ended here, with the habit of showing up. The cabin had settled into its season, windows open to lake breeze, floorboards warmed by steady use. Claire had stacked new books on the coffee table, donations for the library in town. Ellen's laughter had filled the kitchen last night, soft and bright as spoons tapping against coffee cups. On the porch, Alex sat with the magazine open across his knee. A Midwestern business journal had asked for an interview, words on resilience, crisis, and leadership. He had given them what they wanted, but his answers belonged as much to this porch as to their glossy pages. He had spoken about the collision on the Great Lakes, the weeks of sleepless negotiation, the losses counted and endured. But he had also spoken about a stalled elevator, breathwork counted in fours, and a thermos lid pressed into his hand. He had spoken about a town that patched a library roof one pie at a time. They had expected numbers. He gave them presents. Claire listened, leaning against the post, mug warming her hands. She heard not the sound of a CEO defending his empire, but of a man telling the truth of how he had changed. Reflection landed gently here. Grand declarations were easy. Daily proof took muscle. Alex admitted the vow he had once spoken never again. Not love, not trust had been armor. It had protected something raw, something he had never wanted anyone to see. For years, he had mistaken that armor for strength, but it had been fear. Now he carried something else, not a shield, but a rhythm, not protection, but presence. He did not vow against loss anymore. He chose to stay, even when staying cost. That was the courage that mattered. Claire knew the same. Her choice had been to leave when dignity required it, to return to Harbor Point when the noise grew cruel. That choice had not been retreat. It had been strength in another form. It had prepared her to meet him here again, on steadier ground. The images of their life gathered around them like quiet blessings. The lighthouse beam sweeping slow across the lake at night, steady as breath. Ellen laughing at a kitchen table, joints aching less on warm mornings. A calendar filled not with travel and appearances, but with ordinary days inked on purpose. Notes in the margin fundraiser, Friday, pies from Mrs. Carter, board call, Tuesday at 8, walk after dinner, a wristwatch ticking soft against wood, a pendant catching lamplight, a note framed above Claire's desk block letters, one word, breathe. It had started as survival. Now it was a reminder of how far they had come. The climax was no longer a moment of rescue or rupture. It was clarity. The bravest act had not been winning a market, silencing a critic, or outmaneuvering a rival. The bravest act had been staying when staying took courage, choosing to show up again and again, not with spectacle but with the small proof of daily care. The mugs cooled on the rail, the day pressed forward. A list of tasks waited errands, calls, reports. But for this breath, for this morning, there was stillness. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the water once more. Breath in, breath out. The note above the desk said it all, and the long view stretched wide, like the lake, like the life ahead. Life rarely unfolds in grand gestures. More often, it is held together by the smallest acts of kindness, a steady voice in a stalled elevator, a note that says breathe, a hand cream left quietly on a desk. In a world that celebrates wealth, titles, and appearances, this story reminds us that what endures is not spectacle, but presence. Alexander built an empire by control, but he only discovered peace when he learned to stay through uncertainty. Claire protected her dignity in silence, and only when she allowed herself to be seen did she find a love that respected her strength. Their journey teaches us that courage is not about never breaking it, is about showing up again after we do. For many of us, especially as the years turn, the temptation is to believe our stories are fixed. But the truth is simpler. Every breath is a beginning. Relationships are not sustained by vows of never or always, but by daily choices to listen, to honor, to remain. The lighthouse in this tale is not only on a shore in Michigan, it is inside each of us, sweeping steady across the waters of time, reminding us that love and resilience are never out of reach. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, we invite you to let it live a little longer by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of love, courage, and hope to life. Stay with us, and let's keep walking this journey together.